We have saved the best for last with our Dark Alliance builds, with Drizzt being our last build. This sneaky little assassin can't really take a punch, but boy, can he dish one out. Let's get into my Drizzt build for Dark Alliance. This video is sponsored by you. Be sure to hit that big red subscribe button if you enjoy this video, the like, the dislike, all of those things. Now let's go. So with Drizzt, the downside really is that most of his attacks are single target, so you will have to be careful where you are swinging those nice daggers around. But the upside is that he has a really high amount of damage output, as well as a high crit chance and just high crit damage overall. He does also have a low ability cooldown, so we do want to use our abilities as much as possible, though the key focus really with Drizzt is on trying to isolate one or two enemies and killing them, and then moving around the battlefield and just continually doing that throughout the engagement. I mostly focus the range targets and the mages with Drizzt first, same as with Bruna and Wolfgar, because they deal so much damage and they are highly frustrating when they interrupt your attacks, especially with archers. I for some reason feel like there's more archers with Drizzt, but anyway, I mostly deal with these first and then take on the melee guys because they're much easier to deal with as they don't all throw arrows at you all at once. With the Drizzt, you do also want to be moving around as much as possible. When you are standing still, especially using some of his attacks, which I'll get into a little bit later, that require you to stand still, it's a bad time. You should never be standing still with Drizzt. You should be dashing as much as possible, weaving in and out of enemies and trying to deal as much damage as you can, especially from behind, because if you are attacking from behind, you are getting guaranteed critical hits. With our high critical hit damage, it is a highly important thing to do, especially if you are playing in co-op, although it is much harder to do in solo play like myself. Now let's talk about his abilities. Now, the two abilities we're going to be using, one of them is Cloud of Daggers, and that surrounds Drizzt with a swarm of flying daggers. The daggers deal extra damage to enemies around him, as well as inflict bleeding. If you are surrounded by enemies, this is a really good ability to use because it does do a little bit of stagger to the enemies around you, so you can then focus on one target, stagger the ones around you to stop them from actually swinging at you. However, the bleed on this is super important for bosses as well as high value elite enemies. The other is Battle Trance, which grants Vampiric and Frenzy for Drizzt. Frenzy increases your attack speed, and Vampiric gives you some life steal back. So every time you attack, you get some damage converted into health and you get some of that back. It's a good ability to use when you don't want to waste a potion, as well as when you are focusing on elites. I typically use this ability on most of the bosses and elites that I come across. Now, the ultimate for Drizzt summons his little wolf pad to deal damage, and you should spam this pretty much off cooldown on any fight that you do need it. All of Drizzt's abilities, you do become immune to damage when you do trigger them. You do a little animation. You are immune during that animation. It's just well worth noting, so that if you are going to do this, don't be too afraid of taking damage as long as you can get the ability off. Now, to talk about the moves with Drizzt, with all the characters, just buy all the moves as soon as you can, but with Drizzt, I don't really use any specific move set regularly. I kind of flow between a lot of his light and heavy attacks that both have the analog stick either being forward or back, and just focusing on triggering these combinations as much as possible. One thing I will say, however, is his level 15 moves pretty much don't use them. They don't do a huge amount of damage, and they do have a wind up where you just stand still, you wait for the attack to trigger, and then by the time it's triggered, the enemies are probably moved out of its radius anyway. They also don't do a huge amount of damage to warrant the fact that you are standing still. You could be doing much better things with your time than just standing there waiting for that animation to trigger. Now, for your attributes with Drizzt, the key focus is on dexterity for the critical hit chance and critical hit damage especially. Our second attribute is going to be strength. Now, that will just increase your physical damage overall by a certain percentage, as well as giving you armor, which is also valuable because Drizzt does take a lot of damage when he does actually get hit. But because this isn't straight D&D, you can stack both strengths and dexterity together, and you get the most value out of your light daggers that you do have. I would also recommend to put some points into constitution for the stamina, as well as a little bit of health, as well as intelligence for the elemental damage and the cooldown reduction. The lower you can get your ability cooldowns, the better. So probably get your dex and strength to around the 16 mark without gear variations, then put some points into constitution and into intelligence, getting these to around 10, 11-ish, 12, whatever it may be. Let's talk about feats. Now for feats, the main line is going to be the hunter line, which is the offensive line, obviously, because we are pretty much a DPS and that's all that Drizzt can really do. You want to pick up everything on this line, and a key standout here is lightning reflexes. You get a 10% physical damage bonus for 5 seconds after you dash. You should be dashing all of the time, especially to start an engagement. This will just give you a flat 10% damage increase. Make sure sure you're doing this all the time and dashing to avoid attacks rather than parrying, just to keep that damage as high as possible. After you've got everything in this line, you want to go into the expertise, the support line, and get the endurance perk for more stamina and keen mind for the 15% cooldown reduction. After you've got both of these, you can dump the rest of your points into the ranger, the defensive line, and increase your resistances, things like the defensive duelist, which converts 100% of your dexterity into armor, and the armor buff and the health buff, obviously. Potions, potions, potions. Now for potions, health potion obviously max this out. Stamina potion, because we are a melee build, it's also a good idea to have this. You don't necessarily need it as much. I don't use it heaps, as Drizzt's attacks don't deal a huge amount of stamina and don't reduce your max stamina that much. However, it's just a good thing to have. I also like the elixir of concentration for the extra cooldown reduction, as well as the potion of heroism, and maxing this out as soon as possible and using them off cooldown. Super valuable so that you can get the most amount of your abilities and your ultimate off as possible. Now let's gear up. Now for Drizzt, the key set you do want is the Dragon's Bane. You want to get this to 5 out of 8 as soon as you possibly can. This gives you a 50% increase to your critical damage across the board. It's just a huge value to have with the amount of crits you're going to be doing, especially if you're attacking from behind, especially with your high crit chance. Getting this set as high as possible is super important. After that, I'm unsure really what you should focus on specifically. Now, Drizzt has a lot of good and interesting sets that are of decent value, especially if you get epics and legendaries from these. Now, if you get 5 out of 8 in the Dragonbane set, and let's say you've got 2 random legendaries that have really good secondary stats, but they don't give you any set bonuses, until you really get better gear, focusing on those legendaries or epics is a good idea, as this can often overweigh the value of having a 3 out of 8 in one random set if you're putting on 3 greys, for example. Once you do have the gear, 2 sets that you should really pay attention to is the urden Prince, which gives you a 10% damage bonus for rear attacks. This is super valuable in multiplayer when things aren't actually attacking you directly. It's still valuable in single player because you can often spin enemies with one of Drizzt's attacks or just get behind them with various things. There will be times when this set actually does come into value. The other is Remorhaz, which increases your elemental penetration, which you should only be using if you have a weapon that has an elemental effect on it. And in most cases, you should be using a weapon that has an elemental effect, even if it doesn't fit with one of your sets that you do have. It's a super valuable way to just increase your damage by a flat amount without really trying to do anything specific. These are the 2 sets that you should focus on, though there are other ones that reduce like your stamina cost and a couple of other little sets that are interesting for Drizzt that I would play around with if I had just an abundance of gear, but these 3 sets will get you the most value. You could even max out Dragon's Bane and get 8 out of 8 with that set if you did choose to do that, because we are using Cloud of Daggers as well. 4 tips with playing Drizzt. Now, I did mention earlier, but you don't necessarily need to parry that often. If you do have the opportunity to parry, do it, but it's better to dash to avoid that damage, as well as give you that increase to your damage output once you do get back into the fight. You will be moving in and out of the fight with Drizzt. You want to be staying away from damage as much as possible, dealing with the stragglers on the outside of the combat arena, and then focusing on the things in the middle. I often leave the elite for last with Drizzt, whether that be, you know, a troll or a Vobig or whatever it may be. I leave it to last because they require the most attention, but also you want to get rid of the little guys surrounding him as well as the archers, because they will just interrupt your attacks and just make it so much harder to deal with when you can just... And that is Drizzt. Check out my Canterbury build. Canterbury's probably my favorite character, I think, to play as in Dark Alliance, even despite the cheese. But please follow me on Twitter, Instagram, and on Twitch, where I stream 2 days a week, Tuesdays and Thursdays, Australian night times. Hope to see you guys there in the next stream. Thank you for watching this video. My name is NorZZa, and I hope you have a great day.